Hello and welcome to Inside Intelligence, brought to you by the Johns Hopkins University and Advanced Academic Programs. Today's program features Jack Devine discussing the session on spying and covert action made simple. My name is Peter Huggins. I'm the event producer. Today's event will be recorded and uploaded to the AAP YouTube channel under the Inside Intelligence playlist, and that'll be uploaded most likely by tomorrow. If you have any questions during today's event, please use the Q&A function in Zoom webinar, and we'll get to as many of the questions as possible before we finish off at 1 o'clock. I'd like to introduce the moderator of today's session, Dr. Michael Ard, who is the program director and senior lecturer for the MS in Intelligence Analysis program. With that, I'll turn the program over to Dr. Ard.
Thank you very much, Peter, and welcome everybody to Inside Intelligence. We're very pleased to have with us Jack Devine, who is founding partner and president of the Arkin Group, which specializes in international crisis management, strategic intelligence, investigative research, and business problem solving. But he's also a 32-year veteran of the Central Intelligence Agency. He served as both acting director and associate director of CIA's operations outside the United States from 1993 to 1995, where he had supervisory authority over thousands of CIA employees. In addition, he served as chief of the Latin American division from 1992 to 93, and was principal manager of the CIA sensitive projects in Latin America. Between 1990 and 1992, he headed CIA's Counter-Narcotics Center, which was responsible for coordinating and building close cooperation between all major U.S. and foreign law enforcement agencies in tracking worldwide narcotics and crime organizations. From 1985 to 87, Jack headed CIA's Afghan task force, which successfully countered Soviet aggression in the region and for which he was awarded CIA's Meritorious Officer Award. He is also the recipient of the agency's Distinguished Intelligence Medal and several other meritorious awards. He is a recognized expert in intelligence and has written numerous op-ed articles, and he is the author of Good Hunting, an American Spy Master's Story, and The Spy Master's Prison, which came out in 2021. He resides in New York City. We welcome Jack Devine to our program. And Jack, we have a good agenda today: spying and covert action made simple. So let me start out with a simple question: why spying? Why is it still important when there's so many resources that we can rely on, including technical collection, open source, and even digital collection off of computers? Why do we still need spying?
Well, this is why you're going to make this simple for everybody. So first of all, spying goes back to the beginning of time, as far as I know, and so even from the Bible, you'll hear about spying on Jericho and even covert action in the case of Jericho. So it's been part of our human existence. And if you come to the United States and you start looking at presidents, George Washington was a great advocate and user of it. So was Abraham Lincoln, Franklin Roosevelt. You pick all the top presidents during wartime, and they all have had put a heavy emphasis on intelligence. There was one Secretary of State, if I remember, and his name will come to me in a minute, but said, "Gentlemen, do not spy." Right now, he went later on in his career. Yes, later on he changed his mind. Right. Yeah. But today, your point is a real, particularly good one. When I first joined, the level of technology was infantile compared to what we have today. I mean, the concept of big data, being able to Google something and have it at your fingertips, let alone ChatGPT. In other words, the amount of information that is so available in the social media. One of the problems in the analytical side is, how do you sift through all of it? How do you make sense out of it? There's so much repetition, false information. So there are challenges. However, the question is, if you're looking at a crisis somewhere, what isn't going to help you is what is the president of that country's policies? What is he thinking? Where is he going? And some of these things are helpful. but I would say the ability to have human sources close in to decision makers and hostile governments will always be of high value. So I think it's a crowded space. Intelligence is so much bigger. We were just talking about it. No university had an intelligence program. Now all the schools, the major schools have it. It's indicative just how much it's become part of our culture today. We are much more involved in intelligence in every aspect.
The concept has become somewhat democratized as everybody gets in, so many people studying it, but also having access to information that they've never had access before. You raised something about covert action early on the Bible. It goes back to the Bible, and where we see examples of covert action and at work. What about that, though? I mean, we want to talk a little bit more about that today and what role that plays under the general rubric of spying. Let
me go to our theme about trying to make it simple. So let's move right to modern times and CIA. By modern, I'm talking about 1947. That's when the agency was created, and that's when they were given a legal charter for spying. Okay. What's interesting in the charter is it says, you are authorized to spy. The President of the United States believes we need this information, and you're to collect it through human sources and technical means. We didn't have satellites until a few years later, but early on they sensed that. But there's one clause in it that says, and carry out those special activities as directed by the President of the United States. That's the CIA charter for your theme today. That's what covert action is. Not collecting information, it's taking actions in behalf of the president anywhere he wants to go. I want to hit one of my key points at this point, and it usually comes up much further in discussion. I'm able to write books because I was involved in a lot of covert action, as you've pointed out. Most of my colleagues, 95%, would prefer to have nothing to do with covert action because it's fraught with problems. It usually hits the press, and it becomes sometimes it's a very controversial issue. But I've studied covert. I practiced it. I studied it, and the history of it, and I suspect it's very much true today. I know of no case in the history of the CIA where covert action was used without the approval of the President of the United States, and no example from 1973 that wasn't in writing. And all of the things that you talk about that I did in the covert action arena were all at the direction of the President of the United States. I think the average American, and probably large segments, do not believe that, but I defy anyone to come forward and show a covert action that was not authorized by the President of the United States. So that's first simple point that everybody bear in mind.
One of the things that comes out in your book, and because you saw it before the church committee and after, so there was a period of time when you were working in this area, and then before the committee hearings in the mid-70s, and then later. So let's talk about maybe one of your initial cases was in Chile, which was in the early 70s, before the Church Commission, and your experiences with that and covert action.
So I think that's a really good case study, and it was very formative. People need to realize I was on my very first assignment, green, in a foreign land, and I was thrown into the second most important covert action operation in the agency at that time. The other one was Vietnam. Vietnam was largely paramilitary. But the second most important place was Chile. The President of the United States, Richard Nixon, and Henry Kissinger felt that there was a major national security threat coming out of Chile, and that there would be their quote, red sandwich, that if you had Cuba and Chile, that you would be able to convert the Southern Hemisphere into a communist area. So no one invited me in to discuss the policy, right? I just went out there. In fact, I was on the special task force was set up when action was decided to take be undertaken. And it became covert action. That is, the President of the United States said, do whatever it takes to prevent Allende and his socialist coalition, which included the Communist Party, from taking power. This is also important. Presidential directive. The chief of station, who was an old-time World War II veteran from OSS days, wrote back. I actually looked at it today. I was skimming something. And he said, please do not tell people that there's a surefire way of solving this problem. We do not have the capability. It's going to cause bloodshed. It will fail. He received a note from the director based on the president's wishes saying, give it a try. That's bad covert action, okay? Now, I know we could spend this whole session talking about what happened in Chile. I'm going to try and keep it tight. And again, this means that the audience has to have understood some of the history. So back in 1970, President Allende was elected with a plurality of 39% of a leftist coalition and became president. Before he was president, the CIA tried, I'll try and be nice here, a wrong-footed effort. I mean, they just didn't have the capability. But while they were running around trying to find some general to take action, a splinter group of retired military came up with a bright idea unrelated to CIA and without its support or guidance, and tried to kidnap the commander-in-chief of the armed forces. He was killed in the process, the commander-in-chief, and the country completely turned around on that spot and was sympathetic to Allende that he should be president. It's just overnight, everything turned. President Nixon sent out a note saying there will be no more covert action. That's no more, excuse me, let me correct that. No more conspiring with the military, but proceed in covert action in supporting the opposition. So if you fast forward, I was there in 73, and my wife, as I may have mentioned to you, one of my agents got the first report, but I was out having a nice Italian lunch, and one of the officers ran her down and said, your wife ran me down and said that your wife is trying to reach you because it's very important. Well, it turned out one of my agents walked by the house and knocked on it and said, I'm leaving the country. I can't get hold of Jack. This is pre-cell phone and all those fancy things. And there's going to be a coup that starts on the 11th. It'll start at 7. Radio Agricultura will announce it. So I got the report and it went in. So much has been written, so many movies. That was the first official notice that we had any idea that the military was about to bring off a coup. People can believe it, don't believe it. You pointed out something which is really a good reference material for people on this show, and that is go read the Senate's investigation. I was appalled as a young man. I was in my, at that point, very early 30s. And I said, God, you mean I'm out here working, now I'm going to read everything I did. The cable is in that file. And many of the things I did are in that file, not identified because I was undercover at the time. And I thought, this is outrageous. But with the advantage of age and experience, I looked back and reread it and I thought, well, you know, they did an excellent job. They really did. They investigated, they talked to everybody. The story they tell is the story I would tell and have told in the books that you've mentioned. So the agency is often identified as the work with the military to overthrow. It just is not true. The facts don't support it. But was I out there meeting political parties, supporting them, supporting the media against the opposition, which was trying to crush them? And that was indeed something that I engaged in, and I felt comfortable then. I feel comfortable now. I wish we had stayed the course on that, but the military preempted us with a coup.
It certainly was. I mean, Chile then was certainly a Cold War battleground. Obviously, something that people sometimes forget. The Cubans were there. The KGB was there. I mean, it wasn't like it was only CIA was there.
There was a report that came in sometime thereafter. This was the Russians' attempt to bring the Communist Party to power through the ballot box, that they thought they could manipulate. We have very good sources in the Communist Party back in those days. The best source And they were pretty cold-eyed. They knew Allende's weaknesses. They were predicting his shortcomings. And the Russians began to back off because of it, because they thought he was going to fall. But the communists, as I said, were very much in the know. So what happened is we got a report saying we tried it. We tried to get through the ballot box. We're never going to do that again. We'll use force. So in a way, that turned the tide in terms of the Russians' ability or willingness to pursue the ballot box. They thought we could beat them in that playing field. So to some degree, that was a success. I was not happy with Pinochet. I didn't feel that was the right answer. And when asked, as a young man, I said, we should get him out and get the parties back in power. But again, fortunately, no one put that in paper or sent it anywhere. But I think, it was important to stop what was happening, but the way it ended would not have been my preferred path.
One thing I want to just remind our audience today, we have a great turnout today. We'll try to get to as many questions as possible. Do write them short so I can pick them out and relay them to Jack quickly, so we don't get bogged down. Sometimes if you write a lot, I will skip it. So try to write short, pithy questions if you can. Jack, let's talk a little bit more.
If you don't mind, I caught one out of the corner of my eye, which I think.
Yeah. Well, I'm trying to listen and I'm trying to follow.
Yeah, I don't do that, but I couldn't help it. It said, I'm surprised Jack's able to talk this way. And I know most of my colleagues can't because, and so half of my career was involved in espionage, which is a different story. And I did know Rick Ames doing well, and we can talk about that side of the business. But the reason I can talk about it is so much of it became public. Everything I did became public. And this is a lesson to those that want to get into this business in CIA. When you go into it, be prepared. If you live long enough, you're going to read about it. So there's nothing, don't worry about me being drugged out in the middle of this interview because I'm passing on inside information and the CIA people come and drag me away. It's not going to happen. So feel comfortable about that. But there is a lot to be said and a lot of thought that is not, that's different than just straight facts. And that's what I hope to bring to the table today.
Let's talk about Iran. Because that was also one of your important accounts, and in the mid-80s, a fateful time to be on the Iran desk. And that was another example of a covert action effort that didn't go by the book.
This is one that is so multifaceted that I really was tempted to write a book just on this issue. I actually even tried to convince somebody in the media business because I think it's such an important lesson for America and for those who are practitioners in foreign policy, military policy, and particularly in CIA. So for those in the audience that aren't aware or too young to have been part of it, the Reagan administration, as strong and as popular it was in its second term, it almost fell apart over the Iran-Contra affair. So if I'm going to try and do this as tight as I can, I was a chief of station in not in Central America, but not far away. And I wasn't happy the way it was shaking out. So I thought, well, maybe a change of environment. So I knew the chief of the Middle East, deputy chief, and he invited me to go over and take over Iran. So I thought I was out of Central America, made a brilliant move. Now I'm going to work against this demon state that's out to kill us literally. So I started working, and all of a sudden one day I got a call from the director's office. They want you up here right away because we're worried about the hostages and we've got a source who may really be able to help us. I said, well, what's his name? Gobani for it. I was not seasoned in Iran. I knew how to run operations, but I was not an expert. My deputy, fortunately, was. He said, Jack, before you go out the door, glance at this file. This guy's bad news, and he's been 2 burners. He's been polygraphed. He's lied. He's be careful. Don't get us involved, Jack. It was like a major, maybe a colonel, light colonel, if you were converting it. So here I am going up the 7th at this stage. And so the White House had identified a source, and I don't want to bog that story down, but they found a source, and it was Ghorbanifar, and he was a bad source as far as I'm concerned. And the director thought that he had information about hostages, and we were very sensitive about hostages that the Iranians had held. And our chief of station in Beirut, James Buckley, was kidnapped and murdered under heavy torture, and they sent the videos for the president and the head of the CIA. Both of them sat down and watched those horrible things. They were determined to do something about the hostages. So this is rooted, this bad operation is rooted in the best of intentions to help the hostages. But there's issues that then unfold from it. So I said, look, maybe he has information, but we better polygraph him, because this is a person that is well known to the specialists in this field, and they think he's unreliable. So I was authorized. I was pleased with that. I went out with the polygrapher, just the 2 of us, polygraphed him in Georgetown. And he flunked every relevant question. Now, I wasn't in the room. I want to be clear on that. I did know the questions. I wanted to make sure we were hitting the right questions. And he left, and the White House consultant said, "Oh, call me, tell me how it went." Well, the consultant wasn't aware that I worked for the director of CIA, and I didn't report to him. So I left, and we were going to have a meeting with the head of operations the next day. But the consultant somehow was ranting and raving out at those ops centers, saying, "I want to talk to that guy because whoever did it, he beat up Ghorbanifar," which isn't true. I mean, I liked him. Maybe maybe he was reading my mind, but that didn't happen. So when I got a call, the deputy director of operations, "What happened, Jack?" And I said, "Let me tell you, he missed all of his questions." So they said, "We're out of it." And I, young and naive, I pinned a medal on myself for doing what my deputy said, keep us out of it. Well, what I didn't know is the director turned around and gave it off to an analyst who I'm sure didn't want it. And they continued to work with it. And this was in December. And I got a call, when I was dealing with him, it was December. I got a call in February to meet the head of the Middle East division. And I went up and he said, "Jack, you're not going to like this. The president has signed a directive that we're going to trade missiles for hostages. Will you put the flights together?" So I got involved in the logistics of making the flights. I thought it would never happen because it's a bad idea. And it was against our policy, the U.S. policy. The policy was no trading hostages, no trading for hostages. And the reason was, in the decades before, people were being kidnapped around the world, and if you paid the hostage fee, then they would kidnap someone else and raise the fee. So it was a policy. Policy change is the entitlement of the president. The president on the spot can change a policy. That's his decision. So he changed the policy. I wasn't happy about it, but so I went ahead and made the transfer of the weapons. What I didn't know is that Ghorbanifar was double charging, and the rest of the money was going into a secret bank account, and that the White House was working its own operation with some folks off of the books, and they were all dedicated. They all wanted to be successful in Central America and defeat the communists at the time. Their motives were good. The problem was, the Congress had passed a bill called the Baldwin Amendment, which made it illegal for any money to come into the Treasury and to be used for Central America. When that happened, the law was broken. And it was that moment, I was sitting in South Jersey at the beach, vacation or whatever, and when I got back to the house, I turned the TV on, and there's the Attorney General announcing what had happened. And hence we had that huge investigation, congressional investigation. It was never quite clear what the president knew and didn't know. So the reason I think this is such an important case is this is covert action. And when you're doing covert action, you must always stay within the lines. Okay. And I said before, I know of no case where the agency was involved in one that wasn't approved. This was approved, but the agency was not involved in the actual. There was no one, there were a few officers that on their own did that, and they were penalized for it. But the agency wasn't involved in breaking the Bolin Amendment. Some of its officers were, and sadly, because I know they were all people of, strong national interest in our country and so on. But you have to stay within the lines. And I disagree with the policy of trading hostages for missiles, and I think that was a mistake. But that's not a CIA decision. That's a presidential policy decision. So this, and the hostage, some hostages were released, others were seized. And unfortunately, the spark, our chief, Jim Buckley, James, was dead at the time. We didn't find out about it until later. But so that is a bad case of covert action, and a lot of lessons to be learned in that. We talked about Chile, where part of it was bad, and part of it I would consider within the bounds of what I felt comfortable doing. I hope we get to Afghanistan, where I think we have a good case. I don't want to do all bad cases.
we can, let's talk about a good one. Let's talk about Afghanistan and your role in that.
Well, I've addressed it in both of the books, and the second one is interesting because there's so many lessons in Spy Master's Prism that apply to the Ukraine situation, right? And frankly, I have a fairly long section on Ukraine because I was there in 2018 when I was doing the writing on this book, and I said, Putin's going to underestimate Ukraine. He's going for a real fight if he's coming in here, and that this is going to be the center of the third Cold War, right? But so leaving that aside, I was, as I said, doing Iranian operations, and when all this stuff was unfolding, but down the hall was a room, a red door, and nothing on the door, but in there was our Afghan program, and the President of the United States, Jimmy Carter, back then when the Russians invaded Afghanistan in '79, passed the covert action finding, do what you can to push back. And over the years, the program got stronger and better. We would do some new things, the Russians would do it, back and forth. But in late '85, Washington's sentiment, and including the media, was that the Mujahideen was losing. And again, I just want to mention the word Ukraine once in a while. And the president had a meeting. I was not involved. This is secondhand information with the top policymakers, and said, are we going to bleed Russia to death, or is there an end game? And the decision was, let's give it one more huge push. Well, we had a budget of somewhere around 200 to 300 million, depending on which part of the year you're talking. And it went to $1 billion, almost $1 billion, and which was a lot of money in those days. And for covert action, the largest budget in our history up until recent times, there's much more money spent. And the decision was to triple it. And we were, I was put in charge of the new surge, and the fellow Milt Bearden, who's an outstanding officer and a real commander in the field, went out to take over in Islamabad. And it was a big push by many, many people to try and make it work. But we were stymied because of the helicopters that the Russians put into play, the Hind helicopter. We couldn't move 9 million pounds of ordnance across the border. I had mules ready, everything trained. I mean, we were all set, couldn't move it. And we've been trying one way after another to try to get a missile system that would knock out the Hind. And we tried SAMs and blowpipes and various, nothing worked. And I was invited down to what I think would be a sub-cabinet type meeting. And there was a demonstration of a mock Hind helicopter getting hit by a Stinger. And I was rather dramatic, and I think it pounded with it. We have to have that. Now, the truth of the matter is, everybody in the room wanted to have it 6 months before that in the agency, but was not inclined to do it because they're worried about World War III. not knowing any better, I endorsed it. Before I know it, I got a call saying, well, the president signed the authority, you've got the stingers. Then I had to go over and talk to state. I was not state defense. I was the least popular guy that week when I went over and said, I want your stingers. The lieutenant general in charge of all logistics said, Jack, the troops on the front line don't have it. I'm not giving it those to you. And I said, no, I understand, but I've got the fighting more. And I laughed. The White House, I called them and they called him, and I went back, and we were never friends, but we got the missiles. And the amazing thing is we didn't really know what was going to happen. And the first, when it was deployed to the field, the first missile, no one knows this, or it's not popular, but the first one went out, $60,000 sort of bouncing along the ground. And field team called back to Milt and said, oh, that Devine sent us a piece of junk. It was more critical than that, but for your audience, I want to be delicate. But the next three shot down the helicopters, 1, 2, 3, and there was video of it and overhead imagery. And the next day I had the imagery, I think it was September 26th of 86. And I went up and put it on Director Casey's desk. And sometimes you have almost a nonverbal discussion until we got to the point where it was, this is the end. This is going to change the war. And I believe that, but I didn't believe it as dramatically as it happened, because it wasn't shooting down the helicopters. The next day, the Russians started flying out of the range, which allowed all of the support to go across the border. And the decision makers back in Russia started talking about this time, this is going nowhere, we're going to get out of Afghanistan. And I believe their exit from Afghanistan, along with their economy in terrible condition and the exhaustion of the communist line, came together at just the right time. And I think it was a contributor. It is the only, if I had to look at my career, I think I did lucky to be doing a lot of interesting. It's the closest I've got to, I think, where you could say history changed, and I was somewhere in the environment of that when we were fighting the Russians and that missile system went in. That's a good covert action story. Why is it a good covert action? We had a real enemy going in, threatening a region that we really cared about. We had people on the ground that were ready to go. We had bipartisan support. Don't forget that one. Ample funding. This wasn't dabbling, so someone can say back home, I'm supporting this. It was a very measured effort. So, and the outcome, we were optimistic we'd be able to hold them, but the outcome turned out even better in how their departure. Now, I did get to stand on the Friendship Bridge with Milt Bearden and KGB officers in '91, and we'll get to that story maybe at some point. But this is an example of it being done right. The American people were behind it. Congress was behind it. President behind it. You had a country, let me add, we had allies. The Pakistanis were with us, the Egyptians. And believe it or not, in today's environment, the biggest supplier of arms to me were the Chinese. And this is not a secret anymore, but it was then. So that's what makes for a really good program. The one in Chile, I said, you don't do something when you know it's not going to work. I mean, that's irresponsible covert action. You don't, in the Iran case, get off the tracks and do something that's out of sync with our laws. And I look to, and there's many covert actions that have been successful over the years. One of the most famous being 48 in Italy and stopping communism rolling over Europe. But so when you're looking at covert action, I'm an advocate for it and I'm a practitioner of it, but under very strict rules. In other words, before you start to apply, this is why I come back to, you come back to your theme of simple, or a very simple thing. You better be straight with yourself about, will I succeed? Is this feasible? And do I have the resources in that country? You're not going to force feed any covert action. If you don't have people on the ground, it will fail. So there are principles that need to be followed, and they're not as complicated as one may think.
That's a great answer for that. Listen, and Connor, I think that may get after one of our questions here with Connor. Connor, right back. If you want more on that. But I think it said a lot about how in a society such as ours, a democratic society, and the use of covert action, the importance of having the Congress and the public behind something like that for it to work, and for that, and for the officers involved to be protected. Now let's get to another question, I think, that from our audience, and this gets to your Russia interest, Jack, is what's going on now? How is covert action being employed, and how should it be employed?
Well, first of all, it should be employed and within the context of what I'm saying in terms of the rules. Let me put a footnote on the Afghan program before I address that, if you don't mind, Mike.
Sure.
I wanted to mention, there's a good movie called Charlie Wilson's War. And Charlie Wilson was a congressman in Western Texas, flamboyant guy, traveled with him. And the war was called Charlie Wilson's War. And I told Michael this the other day. I said, Charlie once at a restaurant with our spouses reached across and put his hand on my arm and said, you didn't like the book. You're going to hate the movie. He had a great sense of humor. I didn't think it was as funny as he did. But the reason is it wasn't a congressman's war. I want the American people to understand this. This was a U.S. government sponsored by the Congress and the President of the United States. And Charlie Wilson deserves a medal. And people like me get credit. But the truth of the matter is the cable that was sent out from the field said, "We won." And that meant there were a lot of people involved in it. And I also wanted to underscore, while Charlie was a great contributor, covert action really has to be run by the government and controlled by it. They didn't have any decision about what weapons were used, who got them. Maybe 4 or 5 calls that were operationally oriented, absolute most over a year and a half of dealing close with them, never interfered with it at all. So I wanted to set that aside. When we go to the modern world, I went to the other, when Putin invaded Ukraine, I went to my closet to find my coat and dagger because, we're going to come out of duty. Here we are back in the Cold War. I mean, here it is again. I had written a number of pieces talking about the need to return the Russians to return with us to the old rules we had in the Cold War, called Moscow rules, about what you do and what you don't do in the war. And he wouldn't play, apparently. So he unilaterally has a vision that is reminiscent to me of everything I see in the Cold War. He invaded a country that I believe, was democratic, leaning certainly in our direction, aligned with us. And Putin doesn't have communism, and I think that's a great weakness that he doesn't have a uniting ideology. But he has this Wagner group. They're all around the world. People need to stop and look. In Africa, Latin America, they are operating in paramilitary ways, supporting people and trying to work against the West. The West being our NATO allies, but also our friends in Asia and around the world. They're everywhere. And we can address how this blew up in his face, but there's no mistake that he's out there pushing covert action. He's a spy master of the 1950s generation. He's not even of my generation mentally. He's back in the Karla, Cold War, Dresden, and anything goes. So he is a practitioner, and therefore there's room on our side for covert action. And my hope and expectation is, and everything I read will leave me with a sense. This is a part where I will not reveal anything because I don't know anything, but that I do think that the world now, we have to counter him wherever he tries to push, whether it's the Middle East or Africa, into Venezuela. I mean, I think he's in a battle. I think he's in way over his skis. I have 2 op-eds in the Wall Street Journal, one when he went in saying he just sowed the seeds of his own demise, and another one just 2 months ago saying It's not just about Ukraine, it's about the balance of power between the US, its allies, and non-democratic countries like Russia. And this is a new struggle. And so you use the tools of the trade, which includes covert action. There is one other characteristic about covert action. One of the principles is you have to exhaust everything else, right? You don't jump in. And I've been opposed to putting standing armies in places where I would rather have done covert action. Covert action is what you do when, let's say, you're in Africa and you've tried everything else, then you do covert action. And if that doesn't work and our national interests are truly at stake, then we begin to talk about, do we use military intervention? I'm very hesitant. And most people I know, most people in senior positions of government, the last thing they want to do, most generals just dread going to war because they know the price that is paid by the young men and women working for them. So the world we're in, I think covert action is back, should be back.
Let's talk about the counterintelligence aspect of this too, Jack. I mean, in terms of say confronting the Russians and their international grand strategy, how does our counterintelligence play a role in this today?
Well, at the very beginning, you started, why do we need human sources? One of the endeavors is, what is the enemy doing to your own government? I mean, so if you'll bear with me for a second, the most famous spy inside the CIA was Aldrich Ames. As fate would have it, when he first joined the agency, I sat 10 feet from him. I was invited to his wedding and went. And later in my career, I actually supervised him for several months. And I knew Rick very well. And he had flaws that I think are those that make you vulnerable to becoming a spy for the other side. But many people inside the agency had trouble accepting the fact that we could have a spy inside. In other words, that we were so patriotic, so loyal, so that spies didn't come, would never have a spy. And I sat there, and I was, I think, either the number 2 or number 1 at the time, but in operations. And I sat there thinking, we get spies in there. They've always had spies. Why would anybody be surprised? The job is to protect yourself from it. And one of the ambitious administrating officers put out buttons, all these free buttons, never again, after Rick Ames was wrapped up. But the truth of the matter is, I knew that Robert Hansen was out there, and therefore I refused on principle. I just didn't believe that never again we were going to have spies. I don't want to alarm the director. There's probably one floating around somewhere, and you've got to be alert to it. How do you find them? Is by having one in the Russian side, and that's how you need to be aggressive collecting human intelligence. You have to position yourself, because sometimes those sources volunteer. They come to you. And you almost always catch a spy through another spy. We lose our agents because the Russians had a spy in our place. In Rick Ulrich's case, he coughed up the names of 11 of our best spies in the Soviet system, and they were all executed. And the way Rick was eventually wrapped up was because the spy in there had access to information about him. In the case of Hansen, they actually had a video of the spy came out and gave us, not a video, a recording of his voice, and the FBI sat there and heard him. So yes, the battle's engaged, and this is why I think I have no trouble relating to this environment in the context of the Cold War. The big thing that's missing, and huge advantage for us, is there is no ideology. I mean, he's just someone that's trying to recreate a czar relationship without the divine right of kings. So I believe he's way out over his skis because of that.
One of the questions was about Wilderness of Mirrors and the legacy of James Angleton, and as the counterintelligence chief in CIA for many years. Looking back on that, I mean, obviously, Angleton's big obsession was moles within the agency, moles within the U.S. government. But did this create more problems for us? Did we become too paranoid about it? And did this restrict?
There is a real temptation. A little dose of paranoia in my line of work was useful, right? Not too much. You got to weight it. But Angleton knew Kim Philby. I think they were friends at one point. And it really sours you when a friend becomes a spy. It just like, you're just seized with it. It's betrayal. He betrayed his country, he betrayed his friends. So I think Angleton had a deep-seated interest in counterintelligence. He built a myth around himself, I think. I never worked for him. A friend of mine did, but I do remember, you'd go into his office and the room was dark, just that little green lamp on there, and he made himself a bit of a mystery man. But he had a lot to say about penetrations inside of the agency. He got hoodwinked, in my opinion. This is very controversial. A number of CIA people will say I'm totally wrong, but the preponderance in the final decision comes down on where I would come down before, and I did not have part of a role in the decision. And that was a defector came out, and we had him, under containment, if you will, for a couple of years, and no one believed him. But earlier, a defector had come out, and for whatever reason, Jim Angleton just believed that the guy was right. He said, you have all these penetrations. Anybody coming to you saying they're a spy, want to work for you, they're bad. And he believed that. And he said, you have some in there now. And he gave initials. I think one was K, one was S, and that they had Eastern European or Russian orientation. There were a number of officers, their careers were ruined because the agency thought they fit, or Angleton's counterintelligence group thought they fit the bill. Years later, Angleton was removed when Director Colby came to power. He was fired the next day. It was the first thing that happened. And they cleaned house in the counterintelligence area. And those people were rehabilitated in a way in which, they were able to seek reparations, if you will, for it, but it doesn't fix your heart. So they lost their career. So there was I'm sure, and I'm assured that he did great things. But at the time, I thought this, even as a young person, I could feel that there was some drag on our effort to recruit Russians. And I think it was in the overweighting of the counterintelligence threat, and that everybody isn't a threat, and you have to take some chances. So it's a very, very difficult part of the business, but betrayal is central. We do another one someday on buying. What makes people spy? Why does that happen? Well, how do you protect yourself is a theme well beyond covert action, but it's very germane to the business.
We're going to jump around to cover some questions. Maybe the themes will change quickly. One, back to Iran. Iran obviously has, since you were working the issue, has probably expanded its influence in the Middle East. Were we too passive about this? Should we have been using instruments like covert action more, and attempting to check Iran's advances within the Middle East?
Well, I think regime change probably would have been desirable by everyone. But let's come back, because first of all, national security threat. But then you get to my second principle. Do you have any opportunities for regime change? And we've been looking at this since '78, right? And the truth of the matter is, there is no there's nothing there to work with, right? You could go in and make a lot of trouble, stir up problems, but the ingredients aren't there. if you came to me and said, Jack, I got a great idea, I want to change the regime. And so tell me how you're going to do it. And I think the possibilities are there. So your best effort is to get the best intelligence you can, make sure you understand what they're doing, and you block them everywhere outside of there, and you contain them, you make life miserable for them so that the Iranian people decide that they want to change. When that happens, then you can revisit the issue to give them a little extra push at the end. In the op-ed I wrote about Putin, not to jump from place to place, I'm very clear in there that when he falls, and I believe he will, it has to be by the Russian people. And do not try some wild idea to create trouble in there so he's going to go. It just isn't going to work. It'll turn and flip on you. I keep coming back to the same point. You have to do a really careful intelligence analysis of a country. It isn't just you're annoyed and you want to stop somebody. You're obligated, and I believe ethically, to make sure that you can bring success. So you're not going to have bloodshed. You're not going to cause problems and come up with a goose egg. So I would say to you, we should be trying to block them everywhere we can outside of Iran and keep pressure on them internally. But I do not see a role for covert action inside. And I've looked at it many years ago, and I looked at it closely, and it wasn't there. It's not there today. There's more tension inside than there has been a long time. But people have been coming to me for years and said, just light the match. I almost titled one of the books, All It Takes Is a Spark, because I can't tell you how many people would come and say, Jack, my country's in trouble. If you folks would just go in and light a match, it'll all work. And I said, come back when you have all the plumbing in. Let's not talk about matches. Let's talk about what you're going to do and what the real situation is. But all it takes is a spark. If you ever hear anyone come into a meeting in a policy to run, throw them out, throw them out, don't run away, keep your job.
Right, something good is bound to happen.
It'll work out. And
right.
This is the Chile case. It literally said, give it a good try. You can't do that. That cable should never be written.
Exactly. Okay, that's several questions touch on disinformation, which is part of this, can be part of covert action, certainly part of the general, spying work. How do we best deal with this as becoming more of an acute threat, and something that you point out in your book?
I said at the beginning, when I was in the business of covert action, we were in the media side of it, influence side, and disinformation in its infancy, right? I'm not even giving it childhood. If you wanted to have a demonstration, you put up some placards with slogans on it. Today, I can sit here and start to get a crowd rolling, downtown Buffalo, by sending out a series of messages, right? No one even has to see me, and I can cause trouble, right? So the disruptive power of disinformation, the blogs and the ability to get misinformation into the system is mind-boggling, right? AI is going to make us feel like we're in high school today, right? Because it is going to advance the ability to do this. So from an intelligence point of view, how you sift through it is one. The second is social media has a tremendous, from an intelligence, disruptive capability. You can destroy anything. You can't build anything from it, but you can sure as hell destroy people, destroy companies, and cause problems. Again, I would come back. You better have a policy, and you better have. And what I was hoping is that there would be some understanding between the big practitioners, let's say, our adversaries and ourselves, one-on-one. Any document that's signed at the UN or agreement between this country, and I just ignore it. There are people everywhere are going to use cyber to their maximum. And so, including our adversaries, and I hope we're in the game up to our eyes, and I believe we are eyeballs. And so there needs to be rules, but the power of it is mind-boggling, and it's so much harder. It's so much harder, but the average CIA person has so much more power at their disposal if authorized by the President of the United States and overseen by Congress.
get into a few more, and sorry if I'm skipping around a little bit here, but we also talked about a couple of covert actions that didn't go very well. How does policy recover from that? How do we recover from that on say Chile or Iran? What were the consequences, the big fallout?
Well, let's do the Bay of Pigs. The
Yeah,
Bay of Pigs
right.
was one of the big failures, and it predates me, but a number of the people that were in it, including the advisor that brought me to Latin America division, played a big part in it, and I'm grateful for that. And the problem is what Jack Kennedy said to Alan Dulles, who was the head of the CIA. We've just had a big problem, and one of us has to go. And guess who? So it was Alan Dulles on the lead, right? So, and then there's a tendency to pull your horns in. Okay, we're never going to do that again. And that was a mistake. We could analyze that in this theme, but not with the time left. The problem is it's not an accident that in the charter it says carry out those special activities as designated by the President of the United States. So every time there's a flap, people pull back. But then they realize we can't deal with this problem militarily. We can't fix this problem economically or any other way. We need to bring resources to the table, and it comes back. So hopefully we learn lessons. Hopefully, but the book is out. I'm not writing a book saying we finally figured it out, so the next generation can handle it without the flaps. But I think you're on safe base if you start with, you have bipartisan support. If you start with that, your chances of a flap are greatly reduced. Whatever you may think of our Congress today, all of them have the same thing. They want to be reelected, and therefore not out of altruism, but they are going to decide what the people will want and accept in this issue. So you're not going to get much. If you fail and you gave it you gave it your all and it was sensible, the American people will be with you as long as you're candid and full with them. But you save yourself the trouble if you follow the principles that have been laid out historically for a just war or any use of force, and if you have bipartisan support.
That's a striking chapter in your book on just war and how it corresponds to covert action, and especially the need for being proportional to what the threat is and what the potential costs are.
I think it's been around. Augustine wrote to it, and the theologian of the 13th century. It's not novel, other than they didn't know anything about bipartisan support, right? But for generations and those that study ethics and so on, I mean, this has been an issue for a long time. But most of the people that I know may not have even heard of, the arguments for just war, but they go through the same practical considerations. They're practical. Is it really a threat? Is it something we can get done? Is this the last resort? Have we minimized bloodshed, right? And do we have the team to get it done? So, if you stick with that without a formal training in it, the world will be a better place.
Jack, thank you very much today for being with us and talking about your great career and some of the lessons that you've learned on spying and covert action over the years. I'm just going, by the way, folks, so a few of you have been asking about what books to read, things to get ready, or maybe a career. Certainly I would pick up Jack's book, The Spy Master's Prism. You'll learn a lot. If you want to read Legacy of Ashes, go ahead. Just don't make that the only book you read. Don't make that the only book you read, the CIA, right?
Tim and I go back a long way. The writer of the book, he and I are not in agreement, but we maintain a friendly relationship. But Tim and I do not agree. I just want to make sure your readers understand that. The Legacy of Ashes, Eisenhower authorized 300 covert action operations, and he quotes Eisenhower. So it's you might enjoy it, but just remember, have in the back of your head, Jack Devine doesn't agree.
That's right. So thanks again, and thanks everybody for being such a great guest for our program today. Please keep an eye out for more Inside Intelligence webinars coming up. And Jack, we hope to have you back soon to talk to us again.
Great pleasure. Thank you.